So while everybody is getting seated, I'll plug away at my company's conference called Wicked Good Ember. It's in Boston, on an island in the bay. There will be 200 Ember people, and it's going to be awesome. And we already have announced the two keynote slots for the 2 days. It's in June, by the way, June 27th to 28th. Small question: who works with Elixir Phoenix on the back end? Who? Okay, so we have a really cool talk the first day with Chris McCord as keynote speaker, talking about Elixir Phoenix and Ember. And the second day we have Tom Dale doing the closing keynote. So get your tickets. You can already register. Early bird is $200, and you can get group discounts. And the lodging is, you stay on the island or you can camp on the island, which is pretty cool, I think. And we're looking for sponsors in many levels, from cheap to expensive. So, let's
how much is the plane ticket?
Depends on what kind of plane.
Paper plane?
You can blow up an inflatable and go a month ahead, but I have no idea if it's pretty affordable these days. Or ask your boss to pay the plane ticket. That's another thing. So let's get into the talk. I'll talk about closure actions. I yesterday got corrected that I should call it new style actions, but I didn't have the time to adjust my slides, so I'll just talk closure actions. My name is Marten Schilstra. On the internet I'm findable on Marten de Mus, on the Ember Slack and Twitter and whatever. I work for a company called Dockyard. We do consultancy with Ember and staff augmentation. So yeah, if you have an interesting project, call us. So let's talk about closure actions. But actually, before closure actions, I want to talk about the classic actions. Get started. So this is how you previously, like before closure actions were introduced, bound actions to HTML elements. This action keyword is called the element action keyword. It's the way you said, like, if you click on this button, then call this submit action. You can also say which kind of event you want to trigger. So here I added a hash param called submit. So when you submit the form, then the submit action will be called. This is how you bound or bind actions to components by just saying action is safe or another keyword, because action is just an attribute on your component. You just pass a string. And if you call it action, then that action has to be in the actions hash. And if you call the action submit, then it will look up the submit function in your actions hash. And you can, if you want to bubble up the action, you can call send action. And if you want to call another method in the same actions hash, you could just send. So send save model calls the save model function in your in the same actions hash. So this actually looks pretty good, right? So there are a few drawbacks to how we did it. That's why, well, the new style actions have been introduced. So the first one is bubbling up components. Bubbling up components was kind of cumbersome with the old style classic actions. So let's look at an example. So I abstractly here have like 3 nested components, are actually a route template and then 2 components, like the login template and then the login form component, which has a button, an X button. So let's look at the login form or the login template itself. Whoops. So it has a login action, and what it does, well, Balin could tell you. And the login form is rendered in the template. Then the login form has a submit action, and if you click on the X button with login on it, then that submit action is triggered, and that sends the action up with the username and the password. And then you have the X button that was rendered in the login form, and that's a simple component that when you click on the button element, then the click action is called, and then it calls send action. So the goal is to bubble up from the X button to the login controller. So let's see how bubbling up flows from the button to the controller action. So we start at the button, and when you click on it, then the click action in your actions has is being called. And when we call send action in that function, then it will bubble up to the component that renders that component. So in this case, the login form, which I have said if you want to send me the action, then call submit. So we'll call submit, and in submit we call send action with the username and password. And then we'll bubble up again, and then finally we said handle the login action with the login function, and then we're finally there. So that's a lot of steps and a lot of things you have to do. And imagine if it were more steps down, you have to do a whole lot more, even more. So that was a short example of bubbling up components. The second downside was being able to return values. You can't return values from the classic actions, but you can do it with like a hack called callbacks, which is not nice. So let's do an example of that. This is the same login flow, but then I removed like the X button component. And the goal is when you call or bubble up the action, then we want the user that has been logged in back to the login form so we can do stuff with it. So I've modified the login form a little bit. Now we have like an if statement with if there's a user, then show you've been successfully logged in as your username. And I've also changed the component logic a bit. I have like this callback function called setUser, and it sets user on this. In the login form, I've added the setUser parameter, and I call setUser with the user value that I get back from the login function. So let's look at that again, how that works. So we started the button again, we type in our username and password, and then click the login button. And when you click the login button, the submit action gets triggered. You get into the submit action. We send the action with the username and password and the setUser callback. Then we bubble up to the login controller. The login action is called, and we get this setUser callback. We get the user from the login action, or the underscore login action, or function, and we call the set user function with the user we got back from that function. And then it will flow up to, or flow back to our login form, and the set user callback we supplied gets called with the user we called back, and then the user will be set on your component, and then user will be true. So instead of showing the login form null, it will show you have been successfully logged in. But it's not the nicest way. What you wanted to do was just return the user directly instead of having to call the callback. So with those drawbacks in mind, let's look at the closure actions. So before we had this element action keyword, and now we just use the closure action keyword on the button. I want to go back to this slide. It's good to have like old and new together, because I've had some questions about actions, and most of the times it was because they didn't see the difference between new and old actions, because they have a different API, and so people try to use the classic action API with new actions and other way around, and it didn't work. And before we could say on submit, and that doesn't work with closure actions. You have to just assign it to the on submit action on our attribute, yeah. And this is just like an event. That was the word I was looking for. Event attribute element on the element. So if you go to your console and you log an HTML element, you have like a huge list of on this, on that, on that. Well, the closure action will now just be bound to that function. So it's even simpler than it was before. Then before we assign a string to a attribute, and now we use the closure action keyword to assign a action to an attribute instead of a string. And so this is again the closure action keyword, and there are subtle differences between these two almost exactly the same looking buttons. The top one and the bottom one, there's like at the top one you see quotes, and on the bottom one there's no quotes. And what that means is this one will call the action from the actions hash. So and the second one will call the action from just the regular attributes on your component. And well, I'm explaining this quickly, but you'll see it later in action, and then it will probably become a little bit more clear.
No pun intended.
Yeah, sorry. And send action, well, only works for classic actions, and now what you do is get the submit function and then just call it. So yeah, you get this submit, which is just like returns the function, and then you call it with your parentheses. And if you want to pass arguments, then you can do that. So sometimes some people tell me, well, you should use this address.submit to call closure actions. Well, some smart guy called Ricardo Mendes explains it better than I can do. So if you want to know really why, you should quickly get a snapshot of this URL or ask me later. But the gist of it is that this.address was meant for the new Glimmer component. And so And address is still private API for the classic components we're now still using. So yeah, let's go into closure actions even a lot deeper. I have 5 things picked out that I like the most about closure actions. So the first one is passing actions. This is like the same as the bubbling example, but then it's a lot easier to do. You have to write less code. So we start with the items controller, which will render an item list and has a save item action that saves the item. We have the item list itself, which renders each item and has the action save item. The save item has no quotes because we now have the action passed in, so you don't use the quotes because it's not on your actions hash. And then we have the item detail, which has a button, and when you click on it, it will call the save item action with the item. And again, because it's passed in, don't use quotes around your action name. So now we want to go back up again, see how that works. When we click on the button, then the action is called, and we bubble up because we didn't have anything in our component file, or didn't have to define anything in our component file. So we go up, and then we get here, and we again just pass through the action. So there's no thing in our component.js. So we go up, and then we're here, and then the save item action is called, and then that's it. So that's way easier than classic actions. You don't have to call send action each time you go up. So let's move on to currying. The currying in closure actions is not real currying, but everyone calls it currying, so I call it currying too. So again, we have items, an item list, and item detail, but in the item detail you can now see that we have 2 buttons, one that has a save param and another has a destroy param, so likely one will save the item and another one will destroy the item. So let's look at the items controller and template first. We have a do action defined, which expects an item and an action, and it will call the action on the item as a function. And then we have like the item list, and the item list is again just this thing that iterates and renders the item detail component and just passes the item action with the item as a param. And then we have the item detail, which has 2 buttons, one with onclick action item action save, and the other is onclick action item action destroy. And if you paid attention to the previous component, you saw action item, and now you see action item action save. So let's look at the 2 together. So here you have the both. So you see like action item and action item action save. And how you can like interpret this is that it's actually, when you take the last one, it's actually, you should read it as action item and then save. So the item in the item list template is remembered, and then if you call that action again in another template and you add another parameter, it's added to it instead of replaced. And the same goes for the destroy example. So now you have action item and destroy. And let's see how that works in your controller action. So item and save are passed into the action, and thus item.save is executed. And with the destroy, it's item destroy. Yeah, let's move on to return values. This was like one of the biggest drawbacks of closure actions. Closure actions, you had to do the callback stuff that I showed you. So here's
classic actions, right?
Hmm?
You have to do the callback stuff with classic actions.
Yeah, yeah, and now you have to do. You can just return whatever you want, and it's a lot easier. So this was like my previous example, and we're going to add some closure action saws to it. So we had again the login thing, and this was with the classic actions, and we can get rid of the set user and just return this.login username password, which is a lot simpler. So you had this, and you can get rid of the whole callback and just return whatever you want. I even highlighted return. And also you have to change your action in your template to do that. So also the login form, well, only thing I had to do here is change the template a bit and then get rid of the callback and just call the function, get the value, assign it to a variable, and then you set this user. That's all. So let's quickly see this example again, but then with the new style or closure actions. So we click on the button, then the submit action in your actions has will be called the you call the function login with username and password. Then it will bubble up to your login controller, and your login action will be called. You return the user from the login function, and it will go back to your login form, and you get the return value from the function you called in. That will be assigned to user, and then we set user on our components, and then user will be a user, so the if statement will be true, and it will render you have been successfully logged in as well your username. So that's arguably much simpler to reason about than the example I showed you before. This name is the best I could do, but like naming things in code is hard. So yeah, couldn't think of a better name. But I hope I can like give a better example than I can name this. So you have an input, and when someone types in it, the onInput function will get called, and I want to assign the update value action to it. So let's see how we can do that. So this is just an event attribute on your element, and when you trigger an event on an element, the first argument will be an event. Like your plain old, well, in this case, a key event. The event has like target, and target will be the input element, and value on an input element will be the value of your input. So we can set the value to event target value. But can we make this nicer? Well, of course, because otherwise I wouldn't tell you about it. Here's the example again, and if we add like this hash param called value with targeted value, then it will get that key from the first argument that's passed in to the action. So in this case, well, here's a slide that explains this. So what we can do is refactor this now, this action, and just do this, which is much nicer. You don't have to think about, oh well, it's an event and I have to get the target and the value. It's just now I get value and I set value, done. So this is especially good for like people that have public APIs that other people use, and you don't have to think about it yourself, because what if we make this like a component? So we remove the quote so that people can pass in the action instead of that we call our own action, and we put it in a component template, and well, we want to have like a value passed in, so we can have like a initial value in the input, and then we can render it in the template like this, like my input, and then with the value and an update value with the action, our own update value action, and we can just have this little simple action instead of we have to take care of having an event and then set the event to event target value, which is kind of hard to remember. Yeah, hopefully I did better than naming the thing than explaining. So the last thing, overriding functions. This is my favorite part of closure actions. I do it a lot, but some people say, nah, you shouldn't do it, but I think it's cool. So beware, I'll show you why later. When you have a component and you have the function input, then when the input event is triggered, then this function will get called. So we now have an input component, and if you type in the input, this function will get called. But what if there's an evil person that does injection stuff? Then we better sanitize the input. So let's add a sanitize input function. And by default, you just want to like have the input just be returned and do nothing. That's your base component. And then we need to add this little snippet to sanitize, call the sanitize function with the value, and then pass the sanitized value instead of the value passed into the input action. Okay. So normally what you would do is extend that component. So here we extend my input and we override the sanitize function, and we add a nice escape evil HTML function. And then, well, if someone adds evil HTML, then it will be escaped and your users will be happy instead of they get trolled. But there's a better way. At least I think it's a better way. So this sanitize is just an attribute, and we can pass in attributes to components. So we can also just do this. We can pass in the sanitize as an action, and then it will call your sanitize action instead of the sanitize function in your original component. So yeah, I like it a lot. I do it a lot in some things I maintain. So for example, in Ember Form 4 I use this all the time. And well, there's a trolling opportunity because you are really overriding stuff. So for example, what if you assign an action to init on a component with some action? This will happen. You must call this the super when implementing an init in a component, because we didn't call super in the action. So yeah, beware, do not override init, will destroy, or did receive address, and lifecycle hooks like that are already defined on a component. And of course that will also happen, so your function is still called. So that was the landslide deep dive into closure actions. So now I have like a small part left that are awesome add-ons that improve on closure actions, because even though closure actions are cool, they're not cool enough yet. So this is one I wrote myself, although I borrowed the code from someone who showed it to me. So this add-on EMBER-INVOKE-ACTION abstracts away some ceremony about calling closure actions, and adds backwards compatibility with classic actions. So it's more popular with add-on maintainers, so they don't have to think about classic actions and new actions when they make a public component, than with people that write actual apps, because they don't have to think about all the new actions. But what I did was, like, I thought, well, there's send action and send, and I made analogs called invoke action and invoke that do the same thing, but then on the closure action way. So if you pass in the closure action and you call invoke action with the name of the closure action, then we'll call the closure action. If it was a classic action you passed in, then we'll call the classic action, just like send action did. And with invoke you can call other methods on the actions hash, but return values instead of not return values. The other cool one is EMBER-ROUTE-ACTION-HELPER. It calls actions on your route as closure actions, which you can do. It's another reason to forget about controllers, because controllers are stupid. You call them like this in your controller template or route template. So it's almost the same as calling closure actions, but you have to like add route to it. And the last one is Ember composable helpers, which I helped develop a bit. So for example, here we want to have one-click buy. So you edit the cart, purchase, and go to thank you page. So we add them, and then the item will be passed to add to cart. And whatever is returned from add to cart is piped into purchase, and whatever is returned from purchase is piped into the go to thank you page action. And this way you can just define 3 actions in one go in your template. Another cool helper is the square, or the compute helper, which will call an action and render it in your template, whatever is returned. And now comes the coolest slide, the last slide. That's all, folks, people. So, yeah, that's it. So I think we have time for a few questions before Joost takes the stage. So if you have any questions.
Does the pipe helper work with promises?
Yeah.
Cool.
Or
sort of.
Not yet, but will be soon.
Yes, or
there's an issue.
no.
There's an issue open at least, but I think it is already implemented. Cool. Any more questions? Okay.